So today we're jumping into, on my slides, the next chunk of A Christmas Carol. And this is the Ghost of Christmas Present. And I want to walk you through a couple things that I think are pretty interesting and how it interplays with the gospel story. Just remember some backstory here, where we've come from. And I hope I'm not spoiling anything here, but apparently Scrooge, Ebenezer Scrooge, is this cantankerous, grumpy kind of guy, older guy that found himself in a life that was cold and dim, in a very small world, mean-spirited, small in vision, wealthy, but couldn't enjoy it. He kind of missed a lot. And we see pictures of that in the opening scene, the way he treats his one employee, Bob Cratchit. Doesn't even give him enough coal to stay warm in his cold office. Pays him a pittance. Bob can barely make it, to keep out of debtor's prison, which is where you go if you can't pay your debt. We get a picture of him as his nephew Fred comes in and invites him to Christmas dinner, and he's full of Christmas joy. And as soon as he says Merry Christmas to Uncle Scrooge, what is Uncle Scrooge's retort? Bah humbug. He wants nothing to do with that. And the phrase bah humbug was born in 1845 or so because of Charles Dickens. Interesting stuff. And then we see these Salvation Army type guys coming around asking for a gift from the poor. And there we hear some cold-hearted words from Scrooge about, well, aren't these children that are poor, aren't there workhouses for them in case they can't have it? And the poor adults, aren't there debtors' prisons for them to go into? And the retort of the Salvation Army guys, or what their version of it was some people would rather die than go into a debtor's prison where they probably would die. And Scrooge's cold response to that, well, then they had better do it. They had better die and decrease the surplus population. That's the kind of guy we're dealing with. And he gets a visit from his old associate Marley, a warning, the ghost of Marley, saying you're going to get 3 visitors that are going to come in succession, past, present, and future. And they've got a message for you that I hope you'll hear. And last week, Steve looked at that, gave us an unfortunate video clip from what was that guy's name? Mr. Magoo, which was Lauren's favorite and crashed the internet this week, which is why the video was so long to get up. But anyway, no video clips for you today because I got just stuff to talk to you about. And so here we've gone through the Christmas past, and we saw through Christmas past some of what formed Scrooge. That he wasn't born this grumpy, tight-fisted guy. He became that. And partly he became that because of who and what formed him. And then as time went on, he made choices to choose to be the person he would become. Grumpy, angry, cynical, cold. Choosing not to pursue love, but choose to pursue money. All of these things combined together. And one of the scenes that you recognize in the actual literature is that Scrooge, when he's looking at how his former employer, who provided apprenticeship for him, when he looked at how he was treated by old Fezziwig, he had pause and wished he could go talk to Bob Cratchit differently. So you see semblances of what could be in Scrooge. He's starting to massage down into who he could be, not going to be as tight. And so Ghost of Christmas Present shows up, and the picture of this ghost is the life of a Christmas party. Sort of a Santa Claus-y looking guy, but young. He's got a big head of curly hair that kind of looks like a cover of a Harlequin romance, I imagine, the way it's described. He's bare-chested, but he's got this big old robe on that just, I don't know, guess that's how you party back in the 1800s, but that's what he's wearing, and he's happy to do it. He's full of ho-ho-hos and laughter and all this stuff. He's just joy incarnate. He's holding this big old torch, that we're going to see everywhere. He waves the smoke around. Wherever it goes, everybody becomes happier. which sounds a little questionable to me, if you ask me. I'd like to get a little more evidence on what was in that thing he was smoking. But anyway, I digress. So, but one fascinating detail that Charles Dickens gives us shows up on the next slide. Girded round its middle was an antique scabbard, but no sword was in it, and the ancient sheath was eaten up with rust. So this is the same scabbard that has been worn for this time for 1,850 years. A new ghost of Christmas present every year. And what we're seeing here from Dickens is his belief, and I believe a representative of the Christmas story itself, that peace is paramount on Christmas Day. That while there is plenty of turmoil and plenty going on to be upset about, peace is at the core of Christmas. So much so that they long did away with the sword. There's no need for the sword. And the scabbard itself is wearing out because there's no need for armament on that day where it is to be love and joy. It's a beautiful thing. And it's reminiscent of the actual Christmas story, which Dickens knew well. So there was another guy that's related to the story. His name John the Baptist, sort of a cousin of Jesus. And his birth was also quite miraculous. His parents were well into retirement, weren't able to have kids. Zachariah was the father's name, and he was a priest and highly regarded. And he drew the short straw to go make an offering and a prayer at the temple in Jerusalem. And when he went there, he had a vision from an angel of God that let him know that they were going to have a child, and that this was going to be a precursor for something amazing that was going to happen in their time in history. Let's check out what the angel said. Because of God's tender mercy, the morning light from heaven is about to break upon us to give light to those who sit in darkness and in the shadow of death, and to guide us to the path of peace. Well, Zechariah was very familiar with those who sit in darkness and in the shadow of death because he was one of them. Even though he was a priest, he, along with 99.99% of the other inhabitants of ancient Israel at that time, were so poor that they were grateful to have any food in their belly, grateful to have any clothing to wear and shelter over their head. That's how bad it was. And not only were they poor, but they knew they were powerless, utterly powerless. The Roman Empire was over. It was on the country of Israel. They reigned supreme and harshly. And so they knew that if they tried to bend or wiggle even a little bit, it could be the worst nightmare of their lives. They understood debtor's prison. Oh, did they ever? And they understood that most people who went there did not come back. There was a lot of darkness. There was a lot of living in the shadow of death. And yet, the good news was that for those who are so immersed in their pain and their suffering, there's light that's coming. And with that light brings a path to peace. That it's not going to be that way any longer. And Stephen talked about some of the backstory on this last week. And so here we see it within the purview of the Christmas story. This peace thing comes up. And on the very night that Jesus was born, we see it show up once again. So now Jesus has been born in Bethlehem, and now an announcement has been made to the angels. Let's check it out. That night there were shepherds staying in the fields nearby, guarding their flocks of sheep. Just a quick note here. So we got shepherds staying in the fields nearby Bethlehem, guarding their flocks of sheep. If you are on the night shift, that is not a good thing for you. It's already not a great job to be a shepherd, but to be the night shift guy, that's the worst shift ever. And so you have people who are struggling out on these hills watching the sheep, who are hungry, who are tired, who are extremely poor. They are living in darkness and in the shadow of death all the time. They're the ones who get this message. Suddenly, an angel of the Lord appeared among them, and the radiance of the Lord's glory surrounded them. They were terrified, but the angel reassured them. "Don't be afraid," he said. "I bring you good news that will bring great joy to all people." And it continues on the next slide. "The Savior, yes, the Messiah, the Lord, has been born today in Bethlehem, the city of David. And you will recognize him by this sign. You will find a baby wrapped snugly in strips of cloth, lying in a manger." Suddenly, the angel was joined by a vast host of others, the armies of heaven, praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest heaven, and peace on earth to those with whom God is pleased." So we see the final part of this pronouncement is, again, peace. So Dickens' inclusion of the rusted out scabbard that doesn't need to be any better than that because there's not going to be any violence around this thing is manifested and shows up in the announcement. Now you need to understand that through literally every part of the Christmas story, you've got just a few rich people that are involved. And most of the rich people that are involved, primarily the rulers, they're only there to give us dates. You get a little bit more about their character and stuff, but they're not the celebrated characters. I know the wise men come from afar, and that's its own weird thing, which we'll talk about eventually. But in fact, in 2 weeks, we'll hit on that. But you need to understand that all of the key players in this story were not like most of us. They were in darkness, living in the shadow of death. They were poor. They had no rights. Their dreams had to be severely cut back to meet realistic expectations. In fact, if we're just straight up, we would be excluded from this scene, from this story, because of our wealth and our privilege. The story, first and foremost, was not for you and for me. Part of the provocative nature of this story is that every of these key players involved, their eyes had to be reformed. The shepherds are hearing from the angels of God, these stinky, smelly, poor shepherds. That's not supposed to happen. And yet they had to have their eyes refashioned to even believe what they were seeing and then to act on that belief. And Zechariah questioned it. And because he questioned the voice of God, he was mute until John was born 9 months or so later. He had to have his eyes refashioned. Mary had to have her eyes refashioned. I'm not supposed to be able to get pregnant. And here we go. Joseph, same thing. You're not supposed to be pregnant without my involvement. And now I have to believe this. They all had to see with new eyes that forced radical transformation in them. And you would think on their way to Bethlehem, Joseph is like, home stretch. I know God's going to pull out a whopper on this one. Finally. We've been living under this tyranny, and I know there's going to be a warm, comfy bed at the Ritz-Carlton in Bethlehem. No, just more of the same. And so their eyes have to be refashioned once more on what God was doing in their midst. Their eyes refashioned again and again and again. That's what this whole story is about, by the way. Not just the Christmas story about seeing things in a new way, what God is doing, but it's also about the story that Charles Dickens has woven together. It's about a guy who found himself with blinders he did not know he had. And through these experiences of Marley and then Ghost 1, 2, and 3, he sees how he has been seeing. He sees his lens. And then he is redeemed. Spoiler, it turns out good, okay? But his eyes have to be reshaped throughout, and the only way he could do that was with the help of somebody coming along beside him and saying, this is how you were seeing. See, Scrooge, how you saw. And now decide, how do you want to see? It's a challenging thing to do. And just to give you a sneak peek on how this all played out, one of the first scenes that the Ghost of Christmas Present takes him to is poor Bob Cratchit's home. And Bob and Tiny Tim aren't there because they're at a church service. They're celebrating Mass. And it's before they're going to have their Christmas dinner together. And so Mrs. Cratchit is there, and she's getting things together as long as with one of her kids. And it's as good a feast as they can make it. Poor Mrs. Cratchit, she has what's called a double-turn dress. Dresses that were made to wear inside out and backwards, so you could get 4 different wears out of them before you had to throw them away. And on special days like this, they didn't have an extra dress, so they bought bows because you could buy bows cheap. So she adorned her dress with bows to get more festive with what little they had. It's a picture of making the best you can with absolutely nothing. Bob Cratchit shows up with Tiny Tim on his shoulder. And Mrs. Cratchit asks Bob, "So how is Tiny Tim at Mass?" And this is what he says on the next screen. "As good as gold and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful, sitting by himself so much, and thinks the strangest things you ever heard. He told me, coming home, that he hoped the people saw him in the church because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see." And in the story, Bob Cratchit cannot hold back his tears. And as I read it, I couldn't either. And if you've seen the film and it's done well, you can't help but choke up. It's this beautiful, touching moment, and Scrooge sees it all. And things begin to change in him at that moment. He begins to change his vision of what poor kids look like, from these people who may not even deserve to live, to now you have this beautiful, at-risk, vulnerable child who has a depth of understanding that most adults would be proud to have. He begins to worry about, well, given their state, and recognizing, he's seeing Bob in a whole new light too. He's seeing this not as this guy who's just wanting every little nickel because he wants to become like Scrooge and have all the money in the world. He sees this guy who's just trying to raise his family. He's just trying to do life. And life is hard, especially when you've got a kid that's special needs. And he's doing the best he can, but it's hard. And somehow Bob is able to have joy in the midst of it. In fact, as they're sharing this family celebratory grog, which has gin in it apparently, and kids are drinking, I'm not sure about all that. But anyway, laws aside, Bob Cratchit raises a glass. And he says, "I'd like to have a toast to the founder of our feast, Mr. Scrooge." At which point, Mrs. Cratchit has several choice words. Vehement and appropriate, all of them. But Bob Cratchit recognizes, even in that moment, grace, chooses love, even against this person who has caused him great pain. His eyes, Bob Cratchit's eyes, have been refashioned. And slowly Scrooge's are too. So he looks at this scene and looks again at Tiny Tim and asks the question, will Tiny Tim make it? Does he have much life to live? And the Ghost of Christmas Present shares on the next slide. "If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none other of my race," returned the ghost, "will find him here. What then? If he be like to die, he had better do it and decrease the surplus population." Scrooge hung his head to hear his own words quoted by the Spirit, and was overcome with penitence and grief. "Man," said the ghost, "if man you be in heart, not adamant, forbear that wicked cant until you have discovered what the surplus is and where it is. Will you decide what men shall live, what men shall die? It may be that in the sight of heaven, you are more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child. Oh God, to hear the insect on the leaf pronouncing on the too much life among his hungry brothers in the dust." What a penetrating statement. Calling Scrooge on the carpet, saying to him in no uncertain terms, "You're eyes are jaded. Your heart is cold. You look at an entire group of people with cold, dead eyes, with no warmth in your veins whatsoever. And your gaze, which is related to your actions, is actually killing people. We'll get to that in a second. Scene changes. The ghost of Christmas Present takes him to his nephew Fred's home, where the party is ensuing. The party that Scrooge refused to go to, bah humbugged all over the place. And they're carrying on, having some good times, even making a little fun of Scrooge. And Fred talks about Scrooge in loving ways, saying, I just don't understand. What's he out if he comes to our party except to get a good dinner and have a good time? There's nothing but just joy if he would choose to come. And so he makes a statement, even though every year we presume up until this point, every invitation to come to his Christmas party has been met with bah humbug, he still chooses love. He still chooses peace and makes a declaration, I will still go year after year to invite my dark, cold Uncle Scrooge if it's the last thing I do. Because that's what Christmas is about. It's about love. It's about peace. After that scene, some peculiar places Scrooge is taken to. First, he's taken to a miner's camp that's just filthy with black soot. As unhealthy as you can imagine, as dark and hopeless a scene as you can imagine. And yet here are these miners gathered around a fire. And what are they doing? They're singing Christmas carols. And for Scrooge, that had to be a puzzle. Why would these people in such despair sing joy tonight? In the next scene, they find a bunch of sailors fighting these horrible waves out on the ocean, and they're bone cold, soaked wet. And as the scene gets a little more into view, they too are singing carols of God's love and grace. And Scrooge starts to realize that this whole Christmas thing isn't some capitalistic scheme, but it is a declaration of the very hope of God, that there is life that's more than the terror we find ourselves in, and that is the Christmas story. His eyes are more and more starting to get refashioned. He's getting more and more humbled. And finally, the last scene we have of this particular chapter, we find two children clinging to this ghost of Christmas Present underneath his robe. They're hiding, holding on. And the picture that you have, the scene you have, are of grossly neglected children. They look grotesque, almost inhuman in display. And so Scrooge asks, who are they? And on the next screen, we see, they are man's children, said the Spirit, looking down upon them. And they cling to me, appealing from their fathers. This boy is ignorance. This girl is want. Beware them both and all of their degree. But most of all, beware this boy, ignorance. For on his brow I see that written which is doom, unless the writing be erased, cried the Spirit, stretching out its hands toward the city. And I just want you to think about this, about the time that we're talking about. This is England in 1845. The next 100 years for that country are going to see hell unleashed. World War I, followed by World War II. Ignorance, apparently, was allowed to grow and allowed to fester and allowed to result in the most horrific scenes we've ever seen in human history, because nothing was done. So the final statement that the ghost makes in the next slide, Scrooge asks, have they no refuge or resource? Cried Scrooge. Are there no prisons? Said the Spirit, turning on him for the last time with his own words. Are there no workhouses? And that's the end of the visit. And Scrooge is left with this dearth of love. He's had a mirror to his face, a mirror which helped him see how he had been seeing so poorly, and it was cutting him apart. Kind of an ironic reality that this ghost of Christmas present, who is imbued with joy and hope and peace for Scrooge at that moment, it was bringing a sword. It was dividing him up. He was in torture, seeing himself so clearly and seeing himself on the wrong side of hope and grace and love. Which reminded me of another sword that was mentioned with the Christmas story. And Steve alluded to this last week. When they're going to take Jesus to get circumcised and presented at the temple, a normal thing that you would do with an 8-day-old baby boy, they were met with a guy named Simeon, a prophet who'd been praying to God to see this Christ, this Messiah, come before he died. And there Jesus came. And so Simeon, on the next slide, says something to Mary, which is quite penetrating. He said, "This child is destined to cause many in Israel to fall and many others to rise. He has been sent as a sign from God, but many will oppose him," including, by the way, those who felt that they were also from God. "As a result, the deepest thoughts of many hearts will be revealed, and a sword will pierce your very soul." As a result, the deepest thoughts of many hearts will be revealed, and a sword will pierce your very soul. That's what Jesus does. We get rebirthed eyes. We start to see in new ways. To my chagrin, I know all too much about this process, and I want to share it briefly with you. You know some of my backstory. I was born to a really good family who were very loving and caring, and sometimes I whine and complain about things that happened to me, but it's whining and complaining by comparison. I got nothing to complain about, really. They loved me. They provided for me. It was a happy, healthy home. We went to church every Sunday, and it was a good thing. We grew up in a fairly moderate kind of a church, and it was all family. It was good. But it was also very white. I grew up in suburban Kansas City. I was born in Kansas City, Missouri, but grew up in suburban Kansas City, where I don't think I saw a black person until I was 8 years old, like personally. Maybe at a baseball game from a distance, but personally. We had a Filipino family living down the street, and they were my brother's best friends, so I knew them well. And thought they were peculiar and some of their cultural habits and those kinds of things, but really a pretty white environment. Then I moved to a little town called Ottawa, Kansas, which you would think would be even more white, but there are actually some African Americans that live there, and one of them became a good friend. And we played together and played football together, and he's a friend on Facebook, and that's super cool. That's one of the things I love about Facebook. But what I recognized back then was, even then, because black was different, my eyes told me to be careful. You may not be able to trust them because they're so different than you. What changed that was my relationship with them. And my parents didn't throw this on me. They never said, "Hey, be careful." Quite the opposite. But it was through relationship and understanding and realizing I'm talking about another human being here that my eyes started to get changed, refashioned, reborn. Moved to Michigan, and we were in a wealthy suburb of Lansing, Michigan called Okemos. This was the suburb that the professors and government officials and business leaders lived outside of East Lansing, where Michigan State University is. And my folks teetered between a couple different suburbs, but they decided to push it a little further to get us there, because the way our educational system works in our country is the quality of the school is generally based on how much the money the school has. And so if you live in an area that has a higher tax benefit for the schools, you generally get better schools, ratings all the way. So they looked for a wealthy suburb because they knew that most likely that was going to be where the best school was. And they were right. It was one of the best schools in the state, and at that time, one of the best high schools in the country. And it was a great high school where I met my first live, real deal Jewish people. If they existed in Ottawa, Kansas, we knew nothing about them. But now I knew them. Now I was going to class with them. And my first reaction, why did you reject Jesus? Right? All kinds of stuff going in my head about why they must not be trusted. And conflicted because Jesus, who I was following for sure by that time, was Jewish, and thinking, wait a minute, you're Jewish, he's Jewish, how am I supposed to do this dance? And then slowly and surely over time, these foreigners became my friends. And we played basketball together, and we played football together, and we acted and danced and sang on stage together, and they're still my Facebook friends. One's name is Kim Ross. She's a pretty big deal attorney in Chicago. And it just brings me delight to see her photos of her dog tearing apart her menorah that she's not entirely happy about. What happened? They became real. I heard their story, and through understanding who they are, my eyes got refashioned. And honestly, that's happened along so many lines, including one that just seems to be a perennial favorite of our day. Lauren Daigle is finding out just how eyes are fashioned right now. She's the pop star artist. I played one of her songs here a month or so ago. She is a Christian artist. She's a Christian, and she started in Christian music, had the audacity to perform on the Ellen show. Ellen, of course, is not shy about being a lesbian. And Lauren's response to the criticism she had just for going on the show was, well, isn't that what we're supposed to be as people of God, loving? And then she went on to say how Ellen herself picked the song that she was going to do, which was an Easter song. So fascinating. Still Roll Stones Away or something like that. I listened to it. Well, since then, the backlash has only increased. People ripping her apart for daring to wonder, daring to question these people. And I got to tell you, that's my journey too. I grew up in a loving house, and it would not have been okay for me to talk so poorly of any other person. But I grew up in an area where PC was not a thing, and gay slurs were common. They were the perfect put down if you wanted to emasculate another guy. And I knew them, and I used them. Over time, I grew in grace, but also grew hardened in a particular vein of theology. And so for a few years, just a few years, I had a more conservative view on the subject and just kind of took a black and white approach to it, like, well, the verses are there, they're pretty clear, so that's it. And even excused myself a step further and said to myself, I remember having a conversation with somebody that I respect a lot, who had a differing view. But I said to him, you know, isn't homosexuality kind of akin to alcoholism, where people are, some people are born predisposed toward alcoholism, and they have to figure out how to manage that. They know alcoholism's not good for them, but you know, they're really the same thing. That's how I got my brain around it. And I'm embarrassed about that. Because it wasn't until 2005, after I finished my doctoral work, that I decided to use all of the tools that I had to study deeply the theological issue of soteriology, or salvation, that I decided to use all of those same tools with all my heavy-duty biblical scholarship and look at those verses finally to find out what is it actually saying. And you've heard me teach about this before. In 2005, literally quickly, because I have the tools to see it, the physical tools, the research tools that most of you do not have. It was a very quick observation that what is being talked about in the scriptures is not the issue that we're talking about today. It's just not. But I didn't talk about it until 2009. And when I talked about it in 2009 and provided the scholarship to CrossWalk, it really kind of went without fanfare, which shocked me. I was like, wow, got away with that one. Who knew? I still have a job. But then 6 years later in 2015, I taught it again. Same scholarship, saying the same things, all 7 verses, hitting each one and saying, okay, these are talking about kids that are held against their own. They're being conscripted into service. This is rape. This is violence. It's not what we're talking about today. What we're talking about today is same gender loving covenant. That was the scope of what I was looking at. And when I talked about that again and basically came down on a side which made some of our folks very uncomfortable, and maybe still, the side was that I don't think this lifelong covenant of 2 people who are committing to each other for the rest of their lives is a disturbance of shalom, which is a good definition of sin. In fact, it looked like love to me. So that was in 2015. And some folks left the church because they couldn't ride with that. Most of the people were affirmative of me and supportive of me. Well, when I did that, it caused problems. And one of the problems it caused was with a role that I've been playing since 2001 with our denominational region called Growing Healthy Churches. In 2001, I became what was called a cluster leader, a mentor. And I met with one cluster up in the North Sacramento Valley and helped these pastors be healthy people and grow healthy churches. That was the goal. And from there, I grew in my role and my scope. And for the last 6 years, I have been Growing Healthy Churches' lead regional pastor, which means that I oversee all the pastors who lead all the other pastors and cluster groups. And I tell them, this is what we're going to read, this is how we're going to discuss, this is the hill we're going to take. And it's gone very well, and I've gotten very good marks on that. And it's an area that was a win-win because I want to do more with the gifts that I have than just our church. I love the church global and want to be a part of that. Well, the reason it caused a stir with that is because the region has a statement which is directly opposed to what I taught. And so immediately, one of the top 3 leaders of the region is saying something that is diametrically opposed to the region's position. And many pastors asked for my head. And there were a lot of cool meetings in the time that commenced after that. Not pleasant. But they kept me, allowed me to continue to work, which I was grateful for. But about a year and a half ago, a guy started coming to our church. And he found our church because there's a website out there that indicated that we would actually welcome him as a gay man in our church and that we would not condemn him. Really. And so he came in very cautious. Sat in the back for a long time. I got to know his story later, and I understand why he was so cautious. This is a kid that was born in a loving family, raised in church every Sunday of his life. He loved his church. He served in his church. The people loved him. It was as tight a family as you can get. And then when he was in late middle school, early high school, he came out of the closet. And as soon as he did, it was met with judgment and scorn. And he was summarily, not officially, but in every other way, kicked out of the church. And it broke him. He took years off, too wounded. When he was an adult, he decided to give another church a shot. And this time, he picked a mega church in our area. And the idea was that if I go to a church big enough, I can hide. And he loved what you often see in megachurches, incredibly intense worship experiences with all the bells and whistles. I mean, it's powerful, powerful stuff. It's not one here in Napa, by the way. It's in another community. And he went and he loved it. It was healing for him. The worship was so good. And so he decided to become involved, and he got slowly involved and wanted to join the church. And so he went through all of their hoops to become a member of the church until the very last second when somebody let the cat out of the bag that he was gay. Now they brought in a pastor who let him know, you're not quite equal here, and you're not going to be a member here as long as you're gay. Awful. So the fact that he gave us a shot was amazing. And I told him straight, I said, hey, we're not all on the same page exactly on this, but I am very confident that you're going to feel welcome here and loved here unconditionally. And that's been true. So true that he invited a friend, just a friend, who started coming with him. And before you know it, they were going through a series that I was doing on some deep theological stuff, and started coming regularly and getting to know more people, and realized there was a membership process here. And they decided to go for membership, and were astonished and delighted that they got to join our church. And it was so exciting to welcome them in, knowing all that they had been through. These guys fell in love, got engaged, and naturally asked if their pastor would marry them in their church. So I met with the board knowing that this was a high-stakes game, and we had a strong meeting, a passionate meeting, a tearful meeting, because there were some voices that were saying, don't do this thing because you have this thing with the region that you're influencing. You're a voice around the table. You're a significant leader. Don't jeopardize that. But at the end of the day, every single person around that board said, how can we not? How can we not stand with these two? When we have welcomed them into our own, we have said, you're a member like anybody else. And so, in a unanimous decision in September, I think it was, they drafted a position that gave me the right to perform any legal marriage at my discretion, and then put it in my court. I waited, because lots of things happen in weddings and they don't always go through. But when I knew that it was, 99% this is going through, bar an earthquake or something like that, I let our executive minister know. This all, by the way, is related to the teaching. This isn't just a bonus for you. It's related because it has to do with fashion dyes and refashioned dyes. But I let him know that this was coming and that I was going to do the wedding. And as soon as he found out that for sure, I was fired. Not from this church. You can only do that. I'm not encouraging that. But they let me go from the position. It was just too provocative, which also means a lot of other things. It meant that when Steve went for his ordination this past Thursday, it meant it was heavily charged. And they wanted to refuse him his right to be ordained by our church because of me. Heavy, heavy stakes at play. And it was crystal clear from that moment that there wasn't going to be a welcome anymore. And that's deeply painful. Deeply painful. So I've been walking wounded for a few months, knowing that this is reality. And such a juxtaposition, because walking wounded because of this painful thing that I knew was going to happen and did happen. And yet, just like the Christmas story, there's this joy and pride and love and hope that I also experience at the same time. It's the weirdest phenomenon. And that's where I'm living, in this tension. And one thing that I also got, a bonus gift, was just a taste. Just a taste. The briefest of tastes of what it must be like to be gay in the face of most people in church, by the attitude I received from those who I worked with closely. And it is just a taste. I had a good friend that is a pastor in Brooklyn, New York. He and I were classmates. We were neck and neck for being a Mr. Ottawa University our senior year. He won it, dadgummit. Somehow he won it. But I was thrilled for him to get it. He deserved it. He was a great guy. He's black, African-American. Got to know him well. He and I were roommates. Anytime the choir or our chorale would go around and do its thing, we'd room together. And we were in Iowa, this little town in Iowa. And he was the only black guy in the choir, as I recall. And you could see people's eyes going back and forth in the audience because they were going to take us home and house us that night. And every time he wasn't called, the guest hosts were like, I mean, it was palpable. Finally, Pete Shaw and Adolphus Lacey were called. I can't tell you what the faces looked like. Concern, a little disgust, kind of clumsy conversation. When we got to their home, these are Christian people from church, a sister church technically of ours, took us down to the basement that they had a bedroom in, and they showed me, well, this is where you could sleep. We've got a nice queen-size bed in here. And Adolphus, there's a couch over there. And I could see what was going on, and I was like, you've got to be kidding me. And I began to taste for just a second what it was like to be looked at with unreborn eyes. Eyes that were not the eyes of grace. Eyes that resembled Scrooge's vision, not Jesus. And so in their presence, not trying to pat myself on the back, but just to talk about how ridiculous this is, in their presence I said, hey, Adolphus, you take the queen bed. I've always loved pull-out couches and made a joke out of it to let them know this just isn't cool. I had to have my eyes refashioned. We're all in that process. This is a delicate issue. An article I pushed out yesterday in relation to the Lauren Daigle thing out of a well-known magazine in the country, said we have a need for greater discernment in our country because we have settled for 7-minute decisions. We've settled with bumper sticker decisions where we align ourselves with parties and we don't do the diligent work of study that is required with things of such power. Scrooge did not know. He did not know that his attitude and that his vision was literally killing children around him, that was literally helping, because he was in finance, literally helping people into debtor's prison and children into workhouses. He thought it was just my attitude. It's just my vision. It's just my life. Let me alone. Bah humbug. But what I want to tell you is that your vision matters to more than you. And that we have an invitation coming from God's self, led by a ghost who visits us 24/7, 365. And that ghost is called the Holy Spirit, who is constantly wooing us, constantly inviting us to see with grace-filled eyes, new and different than we had before, that we see a world different on issues that are challenging because we haven't done them yet. And I'm imploring you to not settle for bumper sticker thinking or quick decisions when you have not done your adequate due diligence. When you have not heard stories, when you have not visited, when you haven't come to a place of understanding. Because if you just simply do that, just make the quick reaction, I am assuring you that you are causing greater problems than you can possibly know. With every gay slur I used back in the 1980s, to whatever even racial jokes I might make in that period of my life, how many people did I wound? So this story is deeper than just a fun little Christmas tale. And that's exactly what Dickens meant it to be. That it self would be a sword for you and me to look at our looking, to ask the question, why do we believe what we believe? What has formed my lens to this point, and am I okay with it still? That's the question. And by the way, turns out it was a part of Jesus too, because he came to bring a sword, not in an imperialistic way like believe or die, like some in the church have done, but this is the sword of truth. And everything in Jesus said, I love everybody. And when he didn't, that was a sword that caused people like Scrooge to look at reality and say, that's really uncomfortable, and yet I have a choice. And some of them chose Jesus. Who do you choose?